Chapter 3068 Tainted Jade. It all happened quickly. One moment, the children of Nether were motionless. The next moment, the square exploded in a storm of violence, its silence torn apart and swallowed by the deafening thunder of breaking stone. 6 of the fallen stone saints attacked. The 7th, their leader, remained motionless, still leaning on his greatsword. The darkness hiding behind the visor of his helmet was cold and boundless, full of chilling malice. The power of nothingness he wielded washed over Sunny and Nephis, sapping them of strength. Saint, meanwhile, seemed unaffected. She activated the stealing power from her fallen kin as well. Her power was similar to that of the Great Devil, but there was a distinction between them. The enemy seemed to harbor a far greater amount of nothingness, and therefore, the effect of his nullification was more potent. He was capable of using it with greater precision. As well, after all, he had suppressed Sunny and Nephis without affecting his own companions. Saint's field of annulment, however, did not make a distinction between friend or foe, so when they activated, Sunny and Nephis fell victim to its denial too. Needless to say, it was an unpleasant experience, but Sunny understood her logic. Their powers were already being suppressed, so adding more pressure was not going to make that large a difference. More than that, there were only 3 members in their small and daring expedition force, so 2/3 of it was being suppressed. There were 7 fallen stone saints attacking them though, so when Saint activated the 6 of nothing, 6/7 of the enemy force suffered from being denied their power. The math worked, even if it was counterintuitive. More importantly, there was a very practical reason why Saint needed to call upon nothingness. It was the swiftest of the 7 great abominations. Each of them wielded power over a single source element, and this one seemed to control time itself. He forced time to flow faster around him, while at the same time slowing its current around Saint. As a result, in the blink of an eye, his spear was already a split second away from slipping into the thin crack between her helmet and her gorget, plunging straight into her neck. When the field of annulment washed over the world, that power was denied, not entirely suppressed, perhaps, but definitely made weaker. That slowed the swift abomination just enough for Saint to lean to the side and avoid the tip of the spear, then push it away with her shield. At the same time, her sword lashed forward. Saint used the enemy's speed against him, leveraging it to increase the deadly force of her tenebrous blade. In the next moment, something soared into the air in a swiftly expanding cloud of ruby dust. It was a spinning helmet with a narrow visor, its plume trailing behind like a torrent of darkness. She had beheaded one of the 7 fallen stone saints. The spell whispered into Sunny's ear, "Thou great demon, saint of tainted jade." Just like that, the 7 enemies had become 6. The remaining 6, though, dealing with them was not going to be easy. One of the great abominations seemed to wield a spatial power, having used it to instantly appear behind Nephis and Sunny. His warhammer was already falling down, threatening to squash Nephis like a bug. The size difference between them was vast, after all. The fallen stone saint was almost 10 meters tall, while Nephis was merely a human. On top of that, the attack had come unexpectedly and from behind her, leaving her little time to react. She still sensed it though. No matter how strong and fast the fallen stone saints were, Nephis was stronger and faster. She was a supreme titan, after all, augmented by the full power of her aspect. So, she managed to turn around and raise the radiant blade of the blessing to block the obliterating blow of the abomination's warhammer. Then, however, something strange happened. Space seemed to ripple, and the abomination's weapon bypassed the blessing entirely. It did not break it, and neither did it pass through it. Instead, the black warhammer simply danced through twisted space, avoiding Neph's block and landing squarely on her chest. The power of that blow was so devastating that she was flung hundreds of meters away, landing in a bloody mess of broken bones on the other end of the square. Neph's body slid across the cold stones, leaving a bloody trail in its wake. Then, however, white flames blazed from her ghastly wounds, washing over her, and she began to rise. Sunny could not observe that, though, because he found himself in a precarious situation. He had been intending to turn into a shadow and wrap himself around Nephis, empowering her, but the attack of the space-bending abomination came too swiftly. Now, not only was he too far away to augment her, but when Nephis was flung away, her radiance also disappeared, plunging his surroundings into complete darkness. Sunny was suddenly blind, his powers utterly stifled, and surrounded by immensely powerful great nightmare creatures to boot. He cursed inwardly. Well, great. What was he supposed to do now? Should I just die? Hell, why not? Sunny probably had a second before the same warhammer that had broken Nephis like a doll and sent her flying across the square came down on his head. Of course, unlike Nephis, he was wearing armor, and a dreadfully tough one at that. But that was the thing about warhammers. Their whole purpose was to deal with heavily armored opponents, and their beaks were designed to break through things that swords and spears could not pierce. If Saint turned her head, Sunny would be able to see his enemy through her eyes and dodge, but considering how deftly the bastard twisted space, he doubted that dodging the incoming blow would be easy, or even possible. Usually Sunny would use Shadow Step in such a situation, but there were no shadows around him, so he couldn't. He could not use shadow manifestation either. Even his most fundamental powers were weakened and suppressed by nothingness. Half a second left. Sunny raised his head, staring blindly in the direction where he thought the fallen stone saint was looming above him. At that moment, a bold idea surfaced in his mind. Yeah, let's try that. Chapter 369. Shadow of Flame. The moment Sunny saw the fallen children of Nether, all of the great rank, he could not help but think about the connection between them and Saint, and his own connection to them, as well. He was wearing the jade mantle, a memory of one of the 7 suits of armor the demon of choice had crafted for his most cherished creations. Because of that armor and because of Saint, who was one of Sunny's swordsmanship teachers, he had always shared a connection to the children of Nether. That connection had culminated in the battle against the puppeteer, allowing him to assume the form of the Jade Titan, a supreme titan form of a stone saint. So, Sunny instinctively thought about assuming that form again. But what was the point? He could use Shadow Dance to mimic some of Saint's traits, but he could not mimic her authority over elemental darkness. True darkness and shadows were too diametrically opposed, after all, preventing him from embodying that facet of his taciturn shadow. And without mastery of true darkness, he would still be blind and powerless even if he turned himself into the Jade Titan. However, the idea of using Shadow Dance to escape this deadly predicament felt like the right solution, in and of itself. After all, with most of his abilities suppressed and no shadows around him, the only shadow at his disposal was his own, and that was all he needed to perform the steps of Shadow Dance. What really made Sunny think about it, though, were the fallen stone saints themselves. He had always assumed that Saint wielded power over true darkness and nothingness simply because that was the innate path of evolution for those of her kind. In his mind, the stone saints all started off wielding no mystical powers, and then gained the same ones as they climbed the classes. Perhaps there was variety in how they expressed that affinity, but the foundation was the same. Witnessing these 7 great abominations, however, had proven him wrong. Each of them controlled a unique element: heat, cold, water, stone, space, time, nothingness. Only Saint wielded 2, nothingness and true darkness. Remembering the peculiar nature of how she had reached higher classes, a bold theory surfaced in his mind. What if Saint had evolved after slaying certain opponents, not because that was the only way she could evolve, but because she chose them? Humans possessed aspects, while nightmare creatures gained profane powers that were innate to their tribes. What about the Stone Saints then? The Stone Saints did not possess aspects, but what if they could design and assemble their own approximations of aspects? That was why, as the Stone Saints grew in power, each of them ended up wielding a unique set of abilities. They were innately capable of accommodating different source elements, and even if their kind shared an innate affinity to some of them, they could consciously develop any affinity they wanted over time. He could not explain why these 7 abominations all possessed drastically different powers otherwise, especially because only one of them was a devil, which meant that the rest were not supposed to have any profane powers at all. So, then, how did that help him in the current situation? Sunny was about to find out if it did. With just a split second remaining before the crushing blow descended upon him, Sunny exhaled and focused on channeling the essence of the Jade Titan. He was very familiar with Saint and her powers, having fought side by side with her for a dozen years, and having felt what it means to be her on top of that. So, he shadowed Saint, while at the same time reshaping his will to resemble hers, channeling the concept of the Jade Titan through himself. However, this time, Sunny took it a step further. If his theory that the Stone Saints could build a semblance of aspects within themselves, and that Saint had chosen to contain dual source elements within herself, Sunny did the same. The first source element he embodied was obvious. It was shadows. The second one was more peculiar. It belonged to someone whom Sunny knew even better than he knew Saint. Someone whom he had known longer and closer than even his most loyal shadow. It was Nephis. Sunny knew Nephis better than anyone else. She had been his first teacher, laying the foundation of his future swordsmanship. It was in a battle against her that he had mastered the first step of Shadow Dance. He had been healed by her flames. He had been burned by them as well. Most importantly, he shared a bond with Nephis, the Shadow Bond. Because of Shadow Bond, Sunny had been able to augment Nephis and learn how it felt to be her. He had been augmented by her flames in turn, learning the taste of their ferocious power. In fact, he had known that taste for a long time. Many years ago, locked in the endless revolutions of Alethea's island, he had used the Mirror of Truth to mirror Neph's ability. He remembered that experience well, and his lightless soul too burned with the flame of divinity. So, even if he did not possess, nothing prevented him from trying to shadow her aspect. To shadow, and that was what Sunny did. Channeling the concept of the Jade Titan, he imbued it with the dual power of shadows and light. In the next moment, his human form collapsed into a torrent of shadows and reformed anew, turning into a towering stone colossus. His body became stone-like and impossibly durable, the jade mantle encasing it like an impregnable carapace. His blood turned into ruby dust. His heart became an immolating furnace that contained brilliant divine flame. But that was not all. A moment later, a blinding white radiance blazed from beneath the visor of his helmet, spilling through the cracks of his armor. That radiance pushed away the darkness, casting deep shadows on the cracked stones of the vast square. Sunny saw his enemy, and the sharp beak of the warhammer flashing through twisted space to crush him. A moment later, he caught the head of the hammer with an iron. Chapter 3070, Mystical Tactics. Sunny had become a towering colossus, his imposing figure encased in a suit of fearsome armor. Blinding radiance shone from beneath the jade mantle, illuminating the shattered stones around him. A moment later, he caught the fallen Stone Saint's warhammer in an iron grip. Actually, Sunny first made a sidestep to avoid the blow, but immediately after, the space around him twisted, placing him square in the path of the enemy's weapon once again. But, having expected that, counted on that, in fact, he managed to catch the warhammer just in time. That was true mastery of combat after all. Not only following the cadence of battle, but dictating it. Sunny knew the children of Nether well, so he could easily read what his opponent would do from the movements of his shadow. Right now, for example, the abomination was not at all rattled by the failure of his blow. Instead, the fallen stone saint immediately pressed the attack, intending to slam the rim of his shield into Sunny's helmet. Steady, pulling the warhammer to throw the enemy off balance, Sunny bent to avoid the devastating shield. Now that he had become a source of light, there were shadows on the fractured ground. Reaching into them, he pulled a sharp sword out of the darkness. A moment later, the blade of the black sword swelled with brilliant radiance, pushing the true darkness further away. With that, his luck had run out. The Space Saint had fathomed the unexpected transformation of his prey and changed his stance, leaving Sunny no openings. The children of Nether were already terribly durable, their armor very tough to breach, and with the addition of a shield, getting past all their defenses seemed all but impossible. Will it work, I wonder? Instead of trying to bypass the enemy's shield and find a crack in his armor, Sunny pushed forward, sidestepped, and plunged his shining sword into the abomination's shadow. As soon as he did, the fallen stone saint shuddered, and a fountain of ruby dust exploded from within his helmet. Saint was immune to soul attacks, and her kin were bound to be at least highly resistant to them. However, what Sunny attacked was not the creature's soul, but its shadow. He wasn't sure if the distinction would matter, but it did, and to calamitous result at that. Very few beings knew how to guard their shadows. 5 to go. Sunny spun, in a rush to come to Saint's aid. By then, the 4 great demons had reached her, unleashing a storm of devastating attacks. Ice covered the joints of her armor, slowing her movements down. At the same time, the stones beneath her feet turned into a mire, pulling her down and trying to trap her. A devastating flood of inky black water crashed into her, and a moment later, a towering figure whose visor burned with infernal flames broke through it, the tip of his radiant sword a split second away from piercing Saint's armor, or at least attempting to pierce it. At the same time, the crushing wave twisted, turning into a second stone-like abomination. That one had already passed Saint, ready to deliver a second lethal blow from the side. Slowed down, immobilized, Saint had little hope of evading either attack. She could try to block one with her shield and deflect the other with her sword. Instead, she turned into a torrent of darkness and rushed past the Fire Saint, assuming her material form far behind him, near the abomination who had encased her armor in a layer of debilitating ice. Her sword plummeted down like the blade of a guillotine, landing on the base of the fallen stone saint's neck. This time, she failed to behead the enemy, but she did breach their armor, dealing the abomination a deep wound. By then, the miraculous flames had already mended Nef's broken body, leaving it pristine and brimming with incinerating power. Despite being separated from the battle by the vast span of the square, she raised the blessing and pointed its tip forward. In the next moment, a ray of pure white light shot from the radiant sword, instantly breaching the distance between her and the enemy. Her aim wasn't precise enough to take out any of the fallen children of Nether, but it did paint the square in a stark combination of white and black, allowing Sunny to step through the shadows and appear next to Saint. Now, it was the 2 of them against 4 great demons. Sunny quite liked these odds. The ruined settlement quaked and collapsed as the battle raged on, each second summoning indescribable destruction into the world. While battling the fallen stone saints, Sunny swiftly came to realize a fascinating detail about how they fought. That detail had to do with their indomitable, malevolent will. What made these abominations so deadly was not only their fearsome power, their daunting resilience, and their sublime armaments. It was also their martial skill, and the fact that they not only possessed potent wills but also effortlessly expressed them as a collective instead of individuals. As a result, the combined power of their wills was far more formidable and oppressive than it was meant to be. Possessing a powerful will and knowing how to express it were entirely different skills. The latter was the core of supreme battle arts, which incorporated will techniques into one's martial style. Sunny and Nephis had been developing their own supreme battle arts for quite some time now, but it was not something that could be accomplished with only training and ingenuity. Perfecting a supreme battle art demanded time and experience, and while Sunny and Nephis were powerful, they had only been supreme for a few years. They had not reached the level of combat mastery the King of Swords and the Queen of Worms had possessed, as far as expressing their will in refined ways was concerned. Sovereigns were solitary beings by definition, and great nightmare creatures did not usually possess enough sanity to employ strategy and showcase refined skill. So, this was the first time Sunny saw a collective will technique, and such a seamless one at that. This was not even a supreme battle art. This was more akin to weaving the will into a tactical formation. Even as Sunny fought for his life against the fallen stone saints, he was absorbing their singular skill like a sponge. He was thrilled to see such a profound and startling will technique in action, but mostly, he was concerned with how to survive it. Chapter 3071. Limits of Strength. The children of Nether were powerful, supremely skilled, and fierce. They wielded their powers with profound mastery, and their will washed over the devastated square like a tide. Fighting them felt like fighting Saint. Theirs was a grounded, methodical, and indomitable battle style. It revealed the depths of their malevolent resolve and felt suffocating in its relentless inevitability. However, today, they had met their match. Sunny, Nephis, and Saint were overwhelmingly powerful themselves. In fact, it was astonishing that a group of great nightmare creatures could pressure them. Having always fought across ranks, Sunny had grown used to only being wary of cursed abominations. A great nightmare creature had to be at least a terror to make him feel tense. For now, their strength was evenly matched, but that was only because the great devil who commanded the other tainted saints had not joined the battle yet. He was still motionless, observing the battle while resting his greatsword on the ground. Sunny was waiting for the moment when the eerie abominations would attack with somber anticipation, knowing that they would suffer as a result. But even as the battle progressed, the devil remained still, and because he did not move, his warriors fell one by one. The fire saint was the most fearsome and devastating among them, his flames capable of melting steel and turning stone into rivers of lava. However, he was also the unluckiest, and luck too dictated the limits of one's strength. It would be difficult to find 3 enemies he was less suited to fight. Saint was extremely resistant to all elemental attacks, after all, so she was all but impervious to his flames. Sunny, meanwhile, had assumed the form of the Jade Titan, inheriting the same resilient trait. Naturally, there was no point in even mentioning Nephis. As a supreme titan who had inherited the fire of Sun God, trying to burn her was an exercise in futility. So, the fire saint fell first. Saint caught him mid-swing, throwing the towering abomination off balance and sending him crashing to the ground with a push of her shield. Then, she destroyed him in the most brutal fashion. Knowing that the enemy would protect the weak points of his armor even while prone, she simply raised her shield and repeatedly brought it down on his helmet. After the first blow, the helmet bent. After the second, it cracked. After the third, it exploded into a cloud of shrapnel, stone fragments, and ruby dust. The fire saint's head was entirely crushed. The ice saint had not fared much better. This one had a slimmer figure, unmistakably female. Her power was both potent and insidious, capable of rendering most terrible foes weak and vulnerable. However, the lethal cold she emanated was easily vanquished by Neph's immolating heat. In some ways, she was even worse off than the fire saint in this battle. Her power was not only ineffective against the enemy, it was directly countered by one of them. She fell second. Nephis unleashed her flames to envelop the ice saint, and even if her armor managed to withstand the impossible heat, it began to glow with incandescent radiance, having turned softer and weaker. Saint used that weakness to pierce her fallen kin's chest, ending her profane existence with one decisive strike. The third of the tainted saints who commanded stone faced Sunny. His power was formidable and profoundly versatile, but its main application was denying the enemy sure footing, which, of course, was a death sentence on most battlefields, where footwork and the ability to push against the earth to generate force reigned. Sunny, however, had become both a source of light and a champion of shadows. As long as there were shadows around him, he could step through them to avoid being caught in the trap of liquid stone. He could also summon more of them from the shadow lantern and manifest them into a layer of matter atop the ground. His enemy could have shifted to a different strategy most likely, but Sunny did not give him the chance. After witnessing the death of the Space Saint, the rest of them knew to guard their shadows. So, this time he simply used brute force to bat the opponent's shield aside and drive his sword into his unprotected armpit. That might not have been a fatal wound, but it became one when Sunny infused the blade of his sword with death will. The Water Saint was the last to die. She was swift and elusive, both fleeting and devastating, but her tidal form could not contend against Neph's flame and the power granted to Saint by Sunny's augmentation. In the end, she was diminished by the heat, caged by the shadows, and killed by Sunny's slaying blade. All four could have unleashed far more devastation if not for the field of annulment summoned by Saint. But then again, the same could be said about Sunny and Nephis. If their powers weren't suppressed, it wouldn't be just the square of the crumbling settlement that had ended up utterly destroyed. It would have been the settlement itself. The square had become a scene of chilling devastation, but the tall obelisk at its center still stood. The last of the tainted saints still stood in the shadow of the obelisk as well. In truth, the battle was over at this point. No matter how powerful that great devil was, he could not be powerful enough to win against Sunny, Nephis, and Saint. More than that, Sunny had not used all of his powers. If he wished to, he could have swayed the scales of battle in their favor even earlier. All 6 of the children of Nether had been slain by him or Saint. After all, that meant that their shades were now under his command. The rest of the Shadow Legion was engaged in the war against the Barrow Wraiths on the Forgotten Shore, but these new recruits could be summoned at any time, and yet, he did not summon them. In fact, after receiving a dark look from Saint, he remained motionless and held Nephis back as well. Saint walked toward the last defender of the crumbling settlement with confident steps. It seemed that she wanted to bring down this great devil, her equal, alone. Chapter 3072. Stalwart beings. A supreme devil was preparing to challenge a great devil. Both of them were children of Nether, even if the vicissitudes of history had led them to different paths. Saint was a shadow now, while her adversary was a nightmare creature. Their battle could end swiftly or rage for a long time, but either way, it was going to leave a bitter taste. Sunny hesitated for a few moments, then chose to respect Saint's wishes and called his second incarnation back. Devoid of his support, she would only be able to rely on her own power in the clash against this fearsome foe. Sunny could not say that he wasn't worried, but he wasn't worried that much either. It would take more than a great devil to shake his confidence in Saint. Standing by his side, Nephis frowned, but made no move to attack the devil. She seemed to understand the poignant meaning of this clash. Saint had not shown any doubt or hesitation when slaying the rest of the children of Nether. In fact, she had been especially cold and ruthless while dealing with them. But now, it was apparent that she did view this battle as special. Both she and her enemy wielded power over nothingness, so there was no telling how their clash would go. But what transpired next was entirely beyond Sunny's expectations. Something strange happened. When Saint approached, the great devil finally moved. He had remained motionless before, even when his kin were being killed. But now, the towering colossus slowly removed one of his hands from the hilt of his immense sword. Sunny frowned. There was something odd about how the tainted saint moved. His movements were strained and unsure, as if he were bearing an impossible weight. The great devil and saint were still for a few long moments, looking at each other in cold silence. There were crimson flames burning behind the visor of Saint's helmet, while the helmet of her enemy only brimmed with darkness. Then, the tainted saint slowly raised his hand, and brought it down upon the blade of his great sword, shattering it. As the shards of the giant blade fell to the ground, he arduously lowered himself to one knee and looked up, peering at Saint. Their silence seemed to say a lot, infused with unknown meaning. Saint lingered for a few moments, then lowered her head slightly in a nod. A moment later, her sword flashed forward, its blade plunging into the narrow crack of the tainted saint's visor. It tore through the back of his helmet next. This time, there was no ruby dust spilling from the black blade. The great devil swayed. Then, his armor collapsed and fell apart, as if there had never been anything inside it at all. The spell whispered into Sunny's ear, as if he was struggling against something. An impossible suspicion settled in Sunny's mind. He hesitated for a long while, unsure if he could even believe in something so far-fetched. But no matter how he thought about it, the suspicion only grew stronger. Was he resisting? Corruption? It was strange that the great devil had remained motionless throughout the entire battle, even when the other tainted saints were being slain. All he had done was subject Nephis, Sunny, and Saint to the power of annulment. But if he had been resisting the urge to attack them that whole time, fighting a silent battle within himself, his actions suddenly had meaning. That devil had not held himself back because of Sunny or Nephis, most likely. Rather, he must have recognized Saint as a member of their kind, the last child of Nether who walked the earth free of corruption, even if it was as a shadow. She was a stone saint who had reached supremacy while walking the path of ascension, and therefore had deserved his recognition. So, the great devil chose to resist in the last moments of his life, rebelling against his very nature. Sunny had never met a nightmare creature who could deny the demented frenzy of corruption, even for a little bit. The puppeteer came the closest, albeit in the case of the spirit of doubt, that resistance was nothing more than pretense meant to lull its enemies into lowering their guard. However, the stone saints were stalwart beings. There was hardly anyone more stalwart, in fact. It was their unshakable resolve that made them immune to mental attacks, so if anyone could push back the power of corruption for a few fleeting moments, it was them. Sunny looked at the remains of the great devil, feeling a hint of begrudging respect. He sighed deeply, then turned to Nephis. Are you all right? The blow of a tainted saint's warhammer had nearly destroyed her supreme body. The harrowing wounds might have healed, washed away by her miraculous flames, but the pain, both of being crushed by the enemy's blow and of being restored, must have burdened her. Nephis nodded. I'm fine. She lingered for a moment, then looked around. We might not be fine, though. These abominations were probably keeping the creature of darkness away from the settlement, but now that they are gone, we are exposed. Sunny studied her quietly. That is not entirely a problem. Some distance away, Saint was standing beneath the towering black obelisk, looking up at the runes carved into its surface in solemn silence. Then, however, the darkness around her moved. 7 towering figures rose from the shadows, assembling into a wedge formation behind her. They were the shades of the tainted saints. The shadow of the stalwart great devil was among them as well. Now, these fallen creations of Nether were Saint soldiers.
Chapter 3073. I asked the Darkness Saint. Had a cohort of subordinate supreme demons now, and even a capable supreme devil for lieutenant. Not only that, but the shadows of tainted saints had spent thousands of years defending the crumbling settlements from the beings that dwelled in true darkness. That was good news for Sunny, who had a feeling that their journey into the depths of the underworld would be an eventful one. They had only just entered it, after all, and already sustained countless wounds. Who knew what would happen in the coming weeks, as they delved deeper into this dark realm? One thing was certain. There would be more battles, more danger, and more wounds. It was not all bad, though. There were powerful shades to be gained, and Sunny tended to achieve impactful breakthroughs under pressure. He had deepened his mastery of shadow dance just now, for example, and there was still room for improvement. Now that he had regained his true name, it served as an anchor. He did not have to fear losing himself anymore, at least not as much, which allowed him to be bolder in his exploration of shadow dance. The progress was already significant. Back on Alethea's island, when Sunny mirrored Nephs with the help of the Mirror of Truth, the summoned flames had been lightless and black, reflecting the true nature of his soul. This time, however, they were pure and radiant, proving that he shadowed Neph's soul and the essence of her fiery power, not just its outward function. Considering that he had needed light, that was a vital distinction. I am still lacking something, though. At some point in the past, Sunny had believed that the 6th step of shadow dance was about channeling the concept of a being and reshaping his will to flawlessly mimic its will, its spirit. However, his opinion had evolved since then. Channeling concepts and bending the will was still an important part of mastering shadow dance, but it was a means to an end, not a milestone, a tool to help him take the next step, not the step itself. Looking back, he should have realized it sooner. Otherwise, the 6th step of shadow dance would have only been useful against deities, which went against the innate versatility of shadows which were meant to follow all beings. Sunny had always had a clear picture of shadow dance before. Once a new step was mastered, its essence became apparent. But now, he felt like he was missing a crucial detail. The fifth step was meant to allow him to shadow the attributes of other beings, while the sixth step was meant to shadow their aspects and powers. Sunny had been learning these steps without the helpful assistance of the nightmare spell, so they became mixed and entangled in his mind. The fifth step had been mastered, but felt incomplete. Sunny could shadow some attributes, perhaps even most of them, but not all of them. The sixth step had partially revealed itself to him but was not fully mastered. Sunny could shadow Saint, but could not control true darkness. He could shadow Nephis, but not her fire. Something was still lacking, and he was starting to suspect that what he was lacking was mastery of the final seventh step of Shadow Step. That step had to be the thread that tied it all together and completed his aspect legacy. The fifth, the sixth, and the seventh steps seemed inexplicably linked, as if they were three parts of the same whole. Sunny had no idea what the seventh step entailed, though. He would have to consider it later. I still made good progress today, though. Sunny sighed. Around him, the crumbling settlement of the Stone Saints stood silent. Sunny and Nephis had already rested after the intense battle, while Saint had spent that time tending to the remains of her fallen kin. Now, it was time to continue the journey. Before that, however, there was one thing left to do. Sunny and Nephis walked toward the towering stele that stood in the center of the square. The square had been decimated, but the black obelisk still stood, unscathed and undamaged by the ferocious battle. There, on its surface, a weave of runes that felt strangely familiar was cut into the ancient stone. As they walked closer and Neph's radiance illuminated the runes, Sunny finally understood where the peculiar feeling of familiarity had come from. They resembled the runes carved into the walls of the ebony tower. One's nether had seemingly carved into the surface of unbreakable stone with his fingernail. The obelisk that stood in the heart of the crumbling settlement bore the writing of the demon of choice. Raising his head, Sunny studied the runes with a pensive expression on his face. What? Was this a poem about death? An ode to darkness? No. It was a record of a conversation between the demon of destiny and death, between the prince of the underworld and shadow god.
Chapter 3074, Prince of the Underworld. Sunny realized that the ancient runes had been left behind by Nether after reading the first few lines. Or a powerful creature of darkness, perhaps. After all, the crumbling settlement was located in the underworld, which Nether had once claimed as his realm, so having a conversation with the elemental force dwelling in the underworld would seem appropriate. But as soon as death and peace were mentioned, Sunny realized that in the context of this conversation, the darkness could only represent one being, Shadow God, the god of peace and solace. That instantly got his attention. In the writings left on the walls of the ebony tower, Nether asked, "What is life?" And in the poem carved into this black obelisk, he was asking, "What is death?" The demon of destiny had been quite interested in philosophy, it seemed, but actually there was a very interesting detail hidden in Nether's poem that had nothing to do with his question, or even with Shadow God himself. It was there, in the very first line, while following the paths that shadows tread. Sunny tilted his head a little. It seemed that the poem described a journey Nether, a much younger version of him than the fearsome prince of the underworld most likely had undertaken once. He explored the underworld and in the process became intrigued by the shadows of the dead that crossed that realm of elemental darkness to make their way to the Shadow Realm. So, he followed, braving the abyss to find Shadow God's throne. That was actually something Sunny had always been confused about. The ancient people seemed to have believed that the shadows of the dead went on a literal journey, physically traveling to the underworld, traveling through its dark depths, and finally reaching their destination after descending into the abyss. But Sunny had never been sure if that was merely a superstitious belief or a literal fact, if the journey of the shadows was a metaphor or an expression of universal laws. Now, it seemed, he had a confirmation. According to Nether, it was true. However, nothing of the sort was happening today. Sunny did not know how the shadows of the dead reached the Shadow Realm, but it seemed to happen almost instantaneously, without the need to go on an arduous journey. So, what changed? He considered the strange dichotomy for a few moments, then looked back to the obelisk with a surprised expression. The answer seems obvious, doesn't it? It was because the world was not the same. Before, the shadows had to travel from the realm where they had perished to the realm of death, and that journey took some time to complete. Now, however, there were no realms. There was only the dream realm. The Shadow Realm had long become a part of it, so the shadows did not have to travel far to reach it. Fascinating. Sunny did not know how that information could be useful to him, but still felt a hint of excitement simply because he had solved a new mystery. Shadow God had not only been the god of peace and solace, he had been the god of mysteries as well. Was that why Sunny could never sate his curiosity? Shaking his head lightly, he turned his attention back to the ancient runes. Lies. It was quite bold of Nether to have accused Shadow God of being a liar, but it revealed a greater truth. Sunny knew that the demon of destiny, and by extension all other demons, had felt some degree of anguish because of the prohibition placed on them by the gods, because they were forbidden from siring offspring. In that way, their claim to life had been crippled, but it seemed that at some point Nether had learned that demons were refused the right to die as well. It all came down to the question Sunny himself had asked the demon of desire in the second nightmare. Why had Sun God chosen to imprison Hope instead of destroying her? It was because demons were children of the forgotten god. According to Weaver, if Weaver could be trusted, demons could not die, they could only be destroyed.
and in the act of being destroyed, the essence of what made them individuals would be returned to the forgotten god, making him stronger and closer to awakening from slumber. The forgotten god was the flaw of existence, and demons were the flaw of the gods. That was what Cassie saw in one of the memories she had inherited, at least. Now that Sunny studied Nether's poem, however, he saw the plight of demons in a different light. If death was peace, if it brought everyone the final solace, then didn't that mean that the demons had been refused peace as well, while at the same time enduring the dire prohibition placed on their lives? No wonder Nether had eventually rebelled against the gods. That happened long after this conversation with Shadow God, though. During this conversation, Nether had still been young and did not seem to harbor negative feelings toward Shadow God, and yet Nether had promised to destroy him. That proclamation wasn't made with malice. Rather, it seemed like mercy. Nether had been denied death, so he promised to bring death to another being carrying the same curse. Death was an aspect of Shadow God. After all, the Shadow Realm was his body. He swallowed the shadows of the dead and dismantled them into pure soul essence within himself. So how could Shadow God die? He couldn't swallow himself, so Nether offered to one day devour the god of death as a favor. How cocky of him. Sunny shook his head in amazement. He wasn't sure how much of the poem was a factual retelling of a real conversation between Shadow God and Nether, and how much of it was a literary interpretation. However, it was clear that Nether had a complicated relationship with the great gods long before his rebellion. Was Shadow God the reason why he had chosen to conquer the underworld and subjugate true darkness? True darkness was what shadows feared, after all. If Nether wanted to keep his promise, absorbing it, and nothingness as well, would have been a profound first step. He failed, though. In the end, neither true darkness nor the power of nothingness had managed to destroy the gods. Instead, they had been consumed by the nightmare spell. It wasn't Nether who had slain them, it was Weaver. So, in a sense, the only power that could destroy the gods was fate, and it was precisely that power that Weaver had wanted to defeat as well.
Chapter 3075, Subterranean River. Sunny and Nephis did not stay in the crumbling settlement for long. He would have loved to explore it, but sadly, the area wasn't safe. These were still the hunting grounds of the creature of darkness they had encountered before, and with the tainted saints gone, nothing was keeping it away from the settlement anymore. Usually Sunny would have swept the entire place with his shadow sense. But now, he could only perceive a small area where light fell, which limited what he could do. There was no guarantee that the creature of darkness would not follow them wherever they went, or that they would not encounter other, even more harrowing beings of its kind. But they had to press on, no matter what perils the underworld had in store for them. Leaving the devastated square behind, they traversed the streets of the ancient settlement. Soon the quiet murmur of water grew louder, and they reached the shore of an underground river. The river was wide and deep, its cold waters flowing like a torrent of liquid darkness. Neff's light could not permeate their depths, scattering across the surface because of that. Sunny felt like he was looking at an ancient mirror reflecting nothing but a vast, starless sky. He studied the river for a short while, then glanced at Nephis. "This is a tributary of one of the three great rivers of the underworld," she nodded. "It should be." Sunny hesitated for a moment. "Then our path is decided, isn't it? We can follow the tributary to the main river, then move upstream until we find the capital of Nether's kingdom." It was a decent plan. Inwardly, though, Sunny felt quite dejected. I hate water. Why was he always stuck having to dive into creepy, dark bodies of water? Sunny shook his head. Nevertheless, he looked at the subterranean river with curiosity. Where did these rivers come from, and where did they flow to? There was no way to tell. He wondered if the lethal currents that rushed through the countless canyons of Moon River Plains and eventually gave birth to the River of Tears came from the underworld. Someone smarter than me will find out one day. Moon River Plains were far away in the southwestern direction. Sunny and Nephis, however, had to travel north, deeper into the underworld. So, he would not have a chance to find out. They were ready to leave the settlement. Saint reduced her weight and took a step off a stone pier, walking across the river as if nothing was the matter. The surface tension of the water was enough to support her weight. Sunny had all manner of ways to traverse the river, while Nephis could fly. However, doing so would require her to constantly channel her aspect, and therefore endure the agony of her flaw. So, instead, Sunny assumed the form of the Jade Titan once more. Back on the square, he had kept his size similar to that of his enemies. Being bigger was not always an advantage, especially when facing skilled opponents of high ranks. Now, however, Sunny unleashed his shadow from the narrow confines of a human shape, allowing it to wash over the world like a dark tide. Then, he shaped himself into the true, colossal form of the Jade Titan, easily 200 meters in height, towering above the crumbling settlements like a dark deity. Stepping into the river, Sunny caused it to seethe and foam around his colossal ankle, spilling from its shores. He took another step, walking deeper into the river. In the end, when he reached its deepest part, water only reached his waist. Nephis landed on his shoulder, looking at the current of dark water from great height. She dismissed the blessing, extinguishing its brilliant light. At the same moment, however, blinding radiance ignited behind the visor of Sunny's helmet, illuminating the river like a powerful searchlight and turning him into a walking lighthouse. He pushed his unfathomable weight forward, displacing a great mass of water and raising towering waves.
Saint moved far ahead, skating on the surface of the river to scout the way. That was how the three of them left the settlement of the children of Nether and journeyed into the depths of the underworld. Their journey was not an easy one. The underworld was vast, and unlike all other regions of the dream realm, it wasn't teeming with nightmare creatures. However, those nightmare creatures that did dwell in its lightless depths were all utterly horrifying. There were abominations dwelling in the river. There were abominations waiting on the shore. And as if their eerie malice was not enough, there were worse things hiding in the darkness. Most of the creatures Sunny and Nephis met were of the great rank. However, these were not at all like the ferocious predators of Godgrave. The loathsome spawns of Godgrave were relatively young, as far as beings of that rank went. They had all been born after the old world ended, created by the Crimson Jungle, tempered by its incessant hunger, made into fierce killing machines. The great nightmare creatures of Godgrave were fearsome, but they were not sophisticated. The abominations that dwelled in the underworld, however, were ancient. They had withstood the endless tides of elemental darkness and made their lairs in its cold embrace. The powers they wielded were as insidious as they were terrifying, and as a result, every day was like a nightmare for Sunny and Nephis. Some days were torn apart by dreadful battles. Some days were quiet and calm, but since danger could descend upon them at any moment, these times of placid silence only served to exhaust them further. The two of them had thought themselves as strong as the strongest beings of their rank, but the underworld had swiftly humbled them. Sunny knew that he would not have survived this journey without Nephis, and while Nephis was strong, she would not have survived the terrors of the underworld alone either. Together, though, connected by the shadow bond, they could just barely move forward.
Chapter 3 Sour 76 Ancient Horrors. Nephis could survive almost any wound, and as long as she was alive, Sunny was not going to die either. No matter what kind of terrifying injury he received, she could heal it in a matter of minutes. Even for wounds dealt by especially terrifying foes, a few days was enough to completely erase them. That did not only mean that they were difficult to kill in a battle, that also meant that their wounds did not accumulate, weakening them more and more as the expedition stretched. Their longevity as combatants was unmatched. However, here in the underworld, the advantage of Neph's miraculous flames was not as great as it seemed. That was because death was not the worst thing facing them by far. The stronger an enemy was, the more insidious their powers were. Abominations this powerful, this ancient, there was no end to ways in which they could threaten Sunny and Nephis apart from mundane physical attacks, soul attacks, mental attacks, even attacks that targeted the enemy's spirit, as well as eerie methods of hunting prey that defied description. The horrors of the underworld could lull you into endless sleep, twist your desires and emotions, poison your mind with ghastly illusions, turn your own powers against you, and so much more. Each battle was a dangerous ordeal. If not for the fact that both Sunny and Nephis had already faced countless horrors, their minds would not have been able to cope with the sheer terror of what they were forced to endure in the darkness, shattering and turning them into raving lunatics. In fact, a person of a lower rank would have been driven mad simply by beholding the harrowing beings that dwelled in the underworld. That was where Sunny's exceptional adaptability and Neph's mastery of shaping shone. Their powers were not only formidable, but they were also extremely versatile, and with Cassie's help they wielded the most dangerous weapon of them all. They wielded knowledge. Simply by knowing what their enemies were, they were already a step ahead of them. So, it took the powers of three Supremes to stay alive in the underworld. As days passed, Sunny was more and more impressed by the fact that Broken Sword and his cohort had survived here as mere saints. It wasn't entirely clear how they had entered the underworld, by venturing into the Hollow Mountains or simply using a nightmare gate to follow the call. But even if it was the latter, they would have still needed to travel some distance to locate the seed. And then there was the way back, as well. Their incredible feat made Sunny feel hopeful. After all, if the original sovereigns had survived the underworld, then didn't it mean that he and Nephis could survive it too? So, they continued forward, undaunted. It took them about a week to reach one of the three great rivers of the underworld. There, the waters ran much deeper, so Sunny could not march at the center of the current anymore, staying away from the shores. Even close to the shore, the water was up to his chest. Standing on his shoulder, Nephis could see the foam seething down below. Saint was still moving ahead, skating across the flowing water at dire speed to keep up with Sunny's titanic form. Darkness billowed around her like a vast mantle. The enemies facing them only became more terrifying after they reached the great river. However, their speed did not diminish by much. That was because Sunny and Nephis were able to maintain their strength instead of being weakened further and further as days passed. They were actually growing stronger. It was partly because they were adapting to the underworld and swiftly learning how to traverse it better, but it was also because Sunny was continuously collecting new shades. There were two types of shades he could summon now. The first type was the great abominations he or Saint had slain. All of them possessed some way to resist elemental darkness, so they were not immediately destroyed when the creatures of darkness attacked, unlike his older shades, who had proven to be extremely vulnerable here in the underworld. The Dark Ones did not only vanquish shades, either, they completely devoured them, destroying the shades forever. So, Sunny hesitated to call upon the veterans of the Shadow Legion. The shades of the great nightmare creatures he had gained in the underworld were more resilient, but did not last long either. They served as a temporary shield between the small expedition force and the Dark Ones. The second type of shades he could summon in the underworld, however, was far more tenacious. They were the shadows of fallen stone saints. The 7 supreme shades from the crumbling settlement were still following Saint. More than that, more of her kin had gathered under her banner over time. There had not been a lot of stone saints in the ancient past.
The first generation of them had been created by Nether, and later, as their number grew, their civilizations seemed to spread along the great subterranean rivers that flowed through the underworld. The mountain Sunny and Nephis used to descend into the darkness had sheltered one of the entrances to their dark kingdom, so even if there were no other settlements along the length of the tributary they followed, there were small way stations, each of them built in the intricately beautiful style of the Stone Saints, but also fortified to serve as a fortress. And there were still children of Nether using these way stations to guard against the horrors that dwelled in the darkness, even if they themselves had succumbed to corruption and become those horrors as well. These abominations were weaker than the 7 great ones that had guarded the settlements merely of the corrupted rank, but their number was greater. Being weaker did not mean that they were weak either. The fact that they had survived in the darkness of the underworld despite being a whole rank below the weakest of the nightmare creatures. Sunny and Nephis met in this lightless realm was a testament to their formidable strength. The fallen children of Nether had survived the endless tides of darkness, but they did not survive Sunny, Nephis, and Saint. The 4 of them swept across the ancient way stations, conquering them one by one. Saint led the charge, augmented by both incarnations of Sunny. The 7 tainted saints and Nephis followed, leaving the stalwart abominations no chance to survive. Like that, Saint's army slowly grew. By the time they reached the Great River, she already commanded close to 100 shades of fallen stone saints, and that number only continued to increase.
Chapter 3077. History of the Underworld. As days passed, filled by cold darkness and grueling battles, Sunny had not only been slaying terrifying abominations and enduring the pain of his titanic form being torn to shreds, he was also slowly learning more about the underworld, and especially about its history. The spell was stingy with granting him memories, let alone echoes, so he had not received any information from their descriptions. He had, however, gained quite a bit from the description of the shades he was gaining. Mostly, Sunny learned from exploring the crumbling way stations they were conquering. One could learn a lot from careful observation. Even if thousands of years had passed, destroying most traces, there were still signs left of what had transpired here. For example, it was clear that the way stations had been meant to house far larger garrisons, but were left with only skeleton crews to guard them. The size of sleeping quarters and the armories did not fit the number of the corrupted stone saints they had to fight, even accounting for thousands of years of attrition. There were also intact writings left in some of the way stations, shining a light on the distant past. Sunny knew that the underworld used to be the realm of Nether, the demon of choice, and that Nether had played a central role in the demonic rebellion. However, what he did not know was just how important the underworld had been for the uprising. The Hollow Mountains, and therefore the underworld, had been unique among all the realms. That was because they were connected to countless mortal realms, bridging the gap between them. Of course, very few were capable of crossing that bridge alive, unless the Prince of the Underworld welcomed them. The underworld had been the central stronghold of the Demon Legion. It was not only nearly impregnable, but also allowed the 6 rebellious demons to swiftly deploy their troops to various mortal realms and move between them, attacking and retreating unpredictably, as well as recruit more warriors to the banner of rebellion. That was why the Demon Legion had been able to contend against the Divine Host in the early years of the war despite being a much smaller and weaker force. But, as Sunny already knew, the Doom War had not been kind to the demons. Despite their initial success, its tides eventually turned against them, as existence itself was coming undone in the annihilating flames of the bitter war between the gods and the Demon. The Demon Legion suffered defeat after defeat and was pushed back on all fronts. That was why Nether and his siblings had made a choice to resort to one last, desperate measure, to open the Void Gate and unleash the forgotten god upon the world. In the last days of the war, the underworld had become the last stronghold of the Demon Legion. The victorious Divine Host laid siege to it, but the demons were preparing to launch a different, far more daring assault. Descending to the darkest depths of the underworld, Nether led their warriors into the abyss and invaded the Shadow Realm, challenging death and its endless legions, the shadows of everyone who had perished in the cataclysm of the Doom War. Sunny had seen the last minutes of that mythical battle himself. That was where Orphney of the Nine had killed Weaver for the 2nd time, and where the nightmare spell was born. So, that was the reason why the entrance to the underworld was littered with ancient corpses, and why the way stations and settlements of the Stone Saints seemed so empty. Most of the Stone Saints had followed Nether to lay siege to the realm of death. The 7 great ones who were slain in the crumbling settlements and the fallen Stone Saints Sunny and Nephis encountered as they traversed the tributary river had been the rearguard of the Demon Legion, those tasked with holding back the Divine Host for as long as possible while the last battle of the Doom War unfolded far below. In the end, the Void Gate had been open, and even though the forgotten god was lulled to sleep by the nightmare spell, corruption still swallowed all of existence. Eventually, the remaining Stone Saints fell to it, as well. Thousands of years later, the realm of elemental darkness was ruled by monsters and abominations. The throne of the underworld was empty, and the Stone Saints who had held the beings of the dark abyss back before were too few to prevent them from conquering its vast expanse. Even those who remained had become nightmare creatures, their nature twisted by corruption. That was the realm Sunny and Nephis had to traverse in search of the last fragment of Weaver's lineage. Traveling along the tributary river had already been perilous enough. When they reached one of the 3 great rivers of the underworld, however, things swiftly went from bad to worse.
There was another settlement of the Stone Saints at the point where the tributary flowed into the main body of the river. That one was no more than a ruin, though, the children of Nether who had guarded it once gone. Instead, a cursed abomination made its nest amidst the rubble. Unwilling to disturb it, they sneaked past the ruins in utter darkness. That was the first cursed nightmare creature Sunny and Nephis had encountered in the underworld, but these were merely its outskirts. Things were bound to get worse as they moved further north, approaching the capital of the fallen Stone Saint civilization. They could challenge this cursed one to a battle, and they stood a good chance of defeating it. However, there was no telling what kind of horrors the echoes of the ferocious battle would attract, and what beings would emerge from the darkness once the fallen deity who had claimed the ruins was gone. Sunny felt like he was on the bottom of the food chain once again. Soon it became painfully apparent that they could not continue traveling in the same manner anymore.
Chapter 3078. A new approach. Sunny looked up, the radiance spilling from beneath his visor and illuminating the boundless darkness above. There, a vast expanse of tattered cloth seemed to be descending upon them, billowing in the wind. Of course, it was not really a giant swath of fabric. It was a creature of darkness he was familiar with, a dark drifter, like the ones who had tried to devour the shadow of condemnation in the realm of death. Sunny did not know what would happen if the nebulous body of the dark drifter enveloped them, and he did not want to find out. Being spiritually digested by an eerie nightmare creature was not on his bucket list. The peculiar flesh of the creature of darkness seemed to ripple and seethe when exposed to the light shining from within Sunny's helmet, but it was not destroyed by it. A moment later, however, a ray of blinding light that spanned hundreds of meters in length sliced through the dark drifter, drowning in the boundless darkness of its billowing body. That was Nephis channeling her flames through the blessing. For a moment, it seemed that the light was swallowed by the darkness. But then, a thin cut appeared on the surface of the dark drifter, its body sliced apart. Standing on Sunny's shoulder, Nephis prepared to deliver a second blow. Sunny, however, was a little preoccupied at the moment, so he could not pay attention to her every move. While the dark drifter was threatening them from above, below, the black waters of the great subterranean river boiled and foamed. Enormous tentacles rose from the dark depths, wrapping themselves around Sunny's arm and neck. There was a powerful nightmare creature attacking his titanic form from below. Wow, look at me. The scene reminded him of traveling across the forgotten shore atop the statue of the builder. Back then, the walking colossus seemed too enormous to be real, like a mysterious deity. Now, Sunny was about the same size, and dealing with problems of the same magnitude as well. The shades of the tainted saints, who used his shoulders as battlements, unleashed a hail of ranged attacks at the sprawling tentacles of the depth dweller. Sunny, meanwhile, raised his other hand and tore into the spongy flesh with the claws of his armored gauntlet, trying to prevent the creature from shattering his neck. The vambrace of his trapped arm was bending, a net of cracks snaking through its surface. Beneath it, Sunny's forearm wasn't doing much better. The creature wasn't powerful enough to crush his bones, but it was close. At the same time, it was expelling a river of corrosive venom that eroded his armor, seeped through its cracks, and burned through his stone-like flesh. The agony was exquisite. Saint, hurry up, please. Saint was nowhere to be seen. That was because just seconds earlier she had increased her weight to its original crushing immensity and plunged into the water like a stone. Now, she was at the bottom of the river, searching for the source of the gargantuan tentacles to destroy it. Sunny felt like his neck was about to snap by the time a powerful convulsion spread through the tentacles, and the spell whispered into his ear. The opposite damaged her armor extensively. It was as if Saint had taken a bath in a vat of it. Sunny hesitated for a moment, then turned to study the shore. At that moment, they were not too far from it. The water only reached up to his chest, while the center of the river was much, much deeper. He studied the shore, illuminating its desolate landscape, and then pointed in the direction of a distant ruin. There did not seem to be any more abominations lurking near the water, so Sunny wanted to rest and recover from the consequences of the battle. After Nephis nodded, he headed toward the shore. Saint was already catching up, gliding across the surface of the river at dire speed. As she approached, the shades of the fallen saints seemed to become more lively, if that word could be applied to the lifeless shadows of the dead, turning their heads in her direction. Soon, Sunny climbed onto the dark stones and finally released the form of the Jade Titan, becoming human once again. The shades spread across the nameless ruin, guarding its perimeter. He, meanwhile, dismissed the jade mantle and sat down on a large boulder with a tired sigh. Nephis approached to take a look at his mangled arm. The damage looked ghastly, some of the deeper wounds revealing glimpses of bone, but it wasn't bad enough for her to use her aspect. Sunny possessed exceptional vitality. After all, given his rank, his arm was going to heal on its own in no time. Nevertheless, that was the third time he had been wounded since they reached the Great River, which happened only a couple of days ago. Ignoring the pain, Sunny sighed somberly and glanced at Nephis. We cannot continue this way. I think it's time to change our approach.